Paul, I was very taken by a piece that you penned for The Australian recently on the fragility of China. Often talk to Jim Molan and Professor John Blaxland, who, like you, are reasonably hawkish about China and under no illusions. But you see some structural weaknesses in it that many others overlook. Give us an outline of a couple of the fault lines you see behind that facade that was so on display in their centenary celebration last week. I thought you made some very persuasive points that some parts of the Marxist-Leninist model seem to be fragmenting.
Yes. I mean, I would put it firstly in terms of, as you put it, a facade. That is that the Chinese Communist Party, like any Communist Party, in North Korea is the same. The Soviet bloc used to be the same, but the CCP's past masters at it present a facade. They engage in highly coordinated propaganda and quite relentless psychological warfare. And too many people, it seems to me, in this country and indeed elsewhere, fall for that as being the authentic China, the authentic Chinese view. And as the party likes to keep saying, the opinion of all the people of China. But of course, nobody who's not approved by the party is given a voice at all. And outside news is now systematically suppressed. So that's the reality of the China we're facing. And the question is, if you look behind that facade, what is it that you see? Well, you'll recall from the piece you were referring to that I made three basic points. The first is that economically, China is more fragile than it lets on. And this is something that a few specialists have been drawing attention to for some years now, that was indeed confessed at the highest levels of the party a decade ago by Wen Jiabao. And that is, in his own words, that the economic model of this very rapid growth was unstable, unsustainable, that major reforms were needed. And the pundits have been saying, if those reforms are not undertaken in the very near future, what you could see is a flatlining of Chinese growth, as we saw with Japan in the 1990s, and for very roughly comparable reasons. My view is that we need to be looking very closely at that, precisely because our economy has become so closely tied to China's growth. And if it was to falter, there's a problem, quite independently of whether the Communist Party's attempts to coerce us economically cause a problem for us. These are two separate issues. The second issue has to do with the political regime. Sorry, yes, you've got a supplementary question?
Yes, and you made the point eloquently about that. And there's a very respectable body of literature about the fact that our paradigm that the West contented itself with while fighting Middle Eastern wars was that China would inevitably liberalise as it capitalised. The opposite has occurred. And you said that the Marxist-Leninist model has reached its use-by date. Can you expand on that one a little bit for us? And also, what you see as the risks of a fragmentation a la the German states? You looked at a Bismarckian figure needing to emerge, perhaps, which could even be more risky than a united China.
Well, I'll come to that second part in a moment. The first issue has to do with the fact that after Mao's rule, Deng Xiaoping and the people around him agreed 30, 40 years ago that that was not good for China. It did not serve China well. And what was needed was a more accountable, more collegial political regime, albeit still a party monopoly, and that leaders couldn't dominate as individuals and had limited terms of office. That was a tentative and conservative step in broadly the right direction. Xi Jinping has reversed that. He's thrown it overboard. That's disturbing. What was hoped for was that China would emulate South Korea, Taiwan, in a slightly different sense, Japan. That is, that as it reached a certain level of prosperity, it would put aside autocracy and one-party rule for a more open political system. There was reasonable empirical data to support that hope. But as you rightly remarked, that's not what's happened. There are people, of course, who are overawed by the demeanour that Xi Jinping presents. And they think, no, this is traditional China and they've got a powerful emperor and wow, we've all got to just come to terms with that. But it seems to me, in fact, that the fragility underlying that facade is what we should be looking at closely, because if you're going to tell a country of 1.4 billion people, of whom 400 or 500 million now live at a Western standard of living, many of whom are educated, they've travelled, that they've got to shape their whole thinking and discourse and behaviour around the thought of one man who says he knows it all. That's simply not a sustainable model. The party wouldn't be engaging in the extraordinary levels of censorship, surveillance, repression, etc., that it is doing if it felt secure, if it felt fully legitimate. It simply wouldn't need all of that. So we look for a legitimation crisis, and we should cease to indulge the party by saying, oh, well, that's China and it's China's internal affair. It's a problem for all of us, and Xi Jinping has made it that. Our patience now needs to be at an end with that. And I don't mean that we should get all angry and fevered about it. We need to be circumspect and really thoughtful about it, but very realistic about it. As for Bismarck, the point I made in the piece was more that Deng Xiaoping was roughly China's equivalent to Bismarck. Bismarck brought Germany together. He made it a modern and industrialising power. He ran a ruthless but very thoughtful foreign policy. He didn't take reckless moves. He famously said, we're always being told to learn from our mistakes. I prefer to learn from other people's mistakes. But when he was removed from office in 1888 by the young Kaiser Wilhelm II, you replaced a very savvy and experienced leader with a young, vain autocrat who surrounded himself with sycophants. That was the path that Germany then took, which ended in the First World War. And my concern at the moment is Xi Jinping is not a Bismarck, he's a Kaiser figure. And you know, the danger of conflict erupting because of an ill-considered move by China has grown appreciably.
You did make the point, though, that he has purged the senior military ranks, and while talk of a cross-straits operation against Taiwan has dominated, you also, again, sounded a salutary warning to those among us who are pessimistic. They may be more fragile militarily than they appear to, aren't they, in that that is not a mean feat to conduct an amphibious invasion of that island, and any pause or any difficulty in achieving the mission could end in regime collapse.
It could indeed lead to a crisis. The biggest concern I would have at the moment is that because he's purged both the officer corps and the security services, he has pointedly arrogated all the decision-making to himself and surrounded himself with people who won't challenge him. That's not good for sound decision-making. And therefore, the potential pitfalls of a strategy, the weaknesses in the military capabilities may be concealed from him because people don't have the courage to point it out to him. They are less likely to stand up to him and say this is a bad idea. And that makes the decision-making process fragile. That is to say, it can slip into bad decision-making rather more easily than if there's a robust professional officer corps who can say this is really not a good idea.
Understood.
I should add...
Paul, go on.
Yes. I was just going to add, you know, those of us in the Western democracies know that, you know, there was robust debate in 2002-3 as to whether it made sense to go into Iraq and overthrow Saddam. And although many people, including many professional people, were opposed, nevertheless the war went ahead. But that's in an open system where there's a lot of debate and where, at least in principle, to some extent, people can be held to account or removed from office. In China, those constraints don't apply, and so the problem is all the more worrying.
Understood. Paul, we could go on all weekend about this. It was a terrific piece and a great traversing of the available literature. I commend it to our viewers. Thank you for your time, Paul Monk. We'll talk again.